Institute Center for Continuing and Professional Studies, we're able to offer 4 AIA continuing ed credits. In order to receive the credits, though, please make sure you signed up on the roster as well as the AIA provider form. Unless your name appears in both locations, we can't give you credit, so please make sure it appears twice. To presenters, Joan in the back will be keeping time. Please try to keep your presentation within limits. The doors here shut at 9, so we have to finish by then. Lastly, in order to keep the training moving, we know there will be questions along the way. I'm going to pass out index cards in a moment. If through the course of the presentations you can write your questions on the index cards, we'll collect them in the end. We'll answer as many questions as we have time to. And if we don't get time to address your question, we'll answer them throughout the week and then issue a Q&A digitally to everybody once the questions have been answered. Okay, so we're going to launch into the training now. A little bit about the help desk. So after Sandy, the mayor put together the Special Initiative for Recovery and Resilience, and one of the recommendations from this initiative was to establish community design centers in impacted neighborhoods. So the help desks were developed, and there are a series of temporary design centers in Sandy-impacted communities that will provide home and building owners with free one-on-one architectural, insurance, and mortgage consultations specific to their properties. So at the help desk, we'll have senior architects who have familiarity with code, zoning, and design issues related to flood-proofing and resiliency measures. They will be supported by volunteers who will assist with intake information, property research, and sketches. Additionally, on hand, we'll have insurance, mortgage, and housing counselors alongside a housing recovery specialist from Build It Back. So the help desk is a partnership between several organizations. Alongside HPD and HRO, we have LISC, which is a national organization that supports community-based organizations in connecting resources with communities. And since Sandy, they've provided relief through their home repair program, mold treatment program, and multifamily loan program. We also have Enterprise Community Partners. They're also a national organization that provides resources and support for community-based organizations working to create affordable housing and healthy communities. Also, we have the Center for New York City Neighborhoods. They're an organization that developed in response to the foreclosure crisis in New York City. And since Sandy, have provided mortgage, insurance, and legal services. They've also developed a really robust flood insurance website that we'll share with you later this evening. We also have the Pratt Center for Community Development. They're an organization that works to create a more equitable New York City for New Yorkers in partnership with CBOs, small businesses, and through policy. Also on board, we have community-based organizations working in the Sandy-impacted communities. We see this as being a vital component to the help desk. So with the CBOs, they're helping us identify potential spaces in their neighborhoods that would be a good place to host the help desk. They're also helping with outreach and supporting client follow-up after the help desk event takes place. So there have been 2 help desks thus far. We're considering them to be the pilots. One was held in the Rockaways in October. The other was in Red Hook in February. And those went really well, so we're signing up for another round of help desk and hope to hold between 6 and 8 help desks between the middle of August and the end of October. Our first one is going to be in the Rockaways. We'll be in Auburn, and through the generosity of the Battalion Pentecostal Assembly Church, and the host is Ocean Bay Community Development, and they'll be working alongside AFI, NILAG, and Queens Legal Services to hold the first help desk next week on August 13th. For volunteers who will be in the Rockaways, the church has 2 locations. The white building, more house-like structure, that's their administrative offices. We'll be there on the 13th and the 27th. And then on September 10th, we'll move to the brick building, which is the church. So some goals of the help desk. We want to continue to provide one-on-one design consultations to property and homeowners, as well as mortgage and insurance consultations. We're very aware that the situations in New York City is different from neighbor to neighbor, and we want to address that. Secondly, we want to assist residents and property owners in understanding their options for rebuilding and resiliency, and give them information to become advocates for themselves. We also want to increase the capacity of designers and the community volunteers. And last but not least, we want to help provide a feedback loop to inform future code and zoning changes. So as a volunteer, we have a few requirements. The first is, this is a professional environment. Be on time. Be aware that getting to many of these locations will take a little bit longer than you think, so just check where you're going beforehand. Secondly, also be aware that the people coming to the help desk, they've had a really intense 2 years. So any frustration or anger you encounter, don't take it personally. Just remember to be patient, act with grace. The goal of this evening is to gain resources for you to use at the help desk. We realize we'll be providing a lot of information in the course of 4 hours. So try to absorb as much as you can, but be aware that you'll have a support system in place that will help you. And if you don't know an answer to anything, it's okay to say, I don't know, and ask for help. There'll be staff there to assist you. I'll be emailing out later this week a list of resources for you to go through, try to read as much as you have time for. I will also be providing a volunteer agreement form, as well as give you an idea of what the client agreement form will look like. We realize that there's only so much information someone can receive within a 30-minute time slot at the help desk, and this agreement basically says, we're providing you services in a limited amount of time with a limited amount of resources, but please do your due diligence and seek professional help after you leave the help desk. I'm going to turn it over now to Michelle McCahey from Enterprise. She's going to go over a little bit of what to expect once you arrive at the help desk and go through the intake system.
Good evening.
Hi. Hi.
So thanks, Kristen. And as Kristen said, I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the logistics of the day, but really introduce you to this client management system that we've developed in Salesforce. Now I'm going to throw a good amount of information at you, but don't worry about absorbing all the details, because there will be help on site, and there will also be more detailed sort of step-by-step instructions once you're on site, and there's some orientation time built into your schedule. So we developed a client management system in Salesforce to assist in managing the client intake and communication throughout the help desk process. So folks are able to pre-register, and we've gotten a handful of folks already pre-registered for the first event. We're able to answer basic intake questions on the client as well as on their property. So for folks who have pre-registered, we're able to know the issues ahead of time and start doing some research. It's also a way to help us manage lines if we get inundated with folks. And it's also how we communicate with the clients after the help desk. So we're able to follow up with information that was discussed during the consultation, as well as any follow-up that needs to happen after the event. And we're also able to identify sort of common issues that come up at each help desk, so that we can make sure we're tailoring our resources and information as we move forward. So as I mentioned, folks have started to pre-register, so we will have some information on their issues, and they will have a scheduled appointment time. So when we mention these clients, typically they're homeowners. They may also be business owners and business property owners. We have had a few renters. And usually, so the outreach is also targeted to the neighborhood each help desk is in, but you may see some folks come in from other neighborhoods. So I'm going to walk you through some of the roles that you'll be assigned on site. And I also want to just sort of give you a disclaimer. I'm using all of these terms like client and intake and dispatcher and level 1 through 4 and case number and all that. And that's just a function of the system. But obviously you are there to humanize this experience. As Kristen said, you know, folks who are coming here have had a really rough 2 years. We want to make sure that this is a positive experience for them. So I'm going to use this language just for, you know, so you understand it when you see it in the system, but that's just for the sake of training. So there is a role of a dispatcher, and this will be played by either Kristen or I. And this role, just so you know it exists, will handle all the pre-registrants, manage the lines if they get too long, help with the greeter with intake forms if the line gets too long, answer system questions that you might have, and track some issues that may need to be elevated to some of our city agency partners. So some of you will be assigned as a greeter. I don't think you've been assigned yet, but you'll know in advance. And so this is the screen that the greeter will see when you come up, but there's a lot here. All you have to worry about is this Cases tab. And when you log in, you'll see a list of folks. If people have pre-registered, you'll find their name in there. If not, when someone walks in, you can create a new case. And this is also when you will give the client a disclaimer form. So before you start doing any intake, you're going to ask them to sign a disclaimer form. So once a client comes in, they sign the disclaimer form, just start talking with them. You're going to ask them some specific questions that are in the system and take notes as you go. We're going to send you, I think by Friday, a paper version of this form so you're familiar with the kinds of questions you'll be asking. So that will make the process a lot easier. Once you've had a sense of the issue that they're having, you'll assign it to a specific volunteer, and that's by changing the case owner. And you'll assign it to either a level 1 through 3 if they need architectural services, or level 4 if they need counseling. And they may come in and need both, but depending on how the lines are going, you'll assign them to the appropriate person, and you'll have some prompts so you know which level to assign it to. And the levels have to do with the level of experience of the architect volunteer. So once you've signed them to a volunteer, you'll also want to schedule an appointment. Seems maybe a little silly if someone's coming in and there's an available volunteer right there, but it's how we're able to track who we saw when. So you'll want to assign them to the volunteer at a specific time, and you'll know if that person's free by the schedule on the bottom. So if you're a level 1 through 4 volunteer, this is your screen. By the time a client gets to you, their information will have already been put into the system. So you'll just click on their number and start reviewing the intake form, some of their basic information. To the extent possible, we'll also ask you to start looking up some of the information in advance while the intake is still happening, or if folks have already pre-registered, so we can get some of the basic information before the client actually comes in. Once you've reviewed all of this, you're going to just start talking with the client and start talking through their issues. And I want to stress how important it is to make sure you take really careful notes in the comment section, because this is how we're going to be able to track issues and communicate with the client in the future. Then there's also a set of pre-populated solutions in the Salesforce system, and they're searchable by keyword. So for example, you could search flood zone, and you'll get a link to the map where you would look up an address in the flood zone. And we'll make sure that you have a chance to get familiar with the solutions that are in there, but just know that that is a resource. And then you're also able to add new solutions if you come up with some genius idea that wasn't already in the solutions by clicking these buttons. You're also able to attach files to the client system. We've encouraged, both in our outreach as well as through our pre-registration system, that the clients bring in any site plans that they already have, any photos that they already have that will assist us in giving them advice. So I'd encourage you to scan them and put them in. If you end up sketching something for them, that should also go in this file. So as Kristen mentioned, there will also be some counselors, legal, housing, and build-up-back counselors. In the Rockaways, these are the groups providing those services. Through the intake process, we will ask ask whether they want to see a counselor. But it's always good to encourage them to see them, even if they didn't express that desire before they leave. So as Kristen mentioned, there's going to be a senior architect on site to answer any questions, any technical questions, and then they'll also close out the case for you. And to close out a case, you'll either say that it's closed and all issues are resolved. You may escalate it to another level. It may remain open and you'll need to follow up with additional research or some questions to DOB or other city agencies. Or it's possible that in the half hour to an hour session, the issue just can't be resolved, or there is no known solution, and then it will be closed and unresolved. And once you close a case, all of the information and the solutions that you have written up will be emailed to the client. So you want to also make sure that you've cleaned it up and that it's as accurate as possible. And that's it. Any quick questions? Again, this was really fast. We'll have on-site orientation, and we'll be on-site to answer questions. Okay. I think I'm turning it over to Caroline to talk about the flood map. Thanks, guys.
Hi everyone, how are you doing? Before I get started, okay, how many of you have familiarity with flood insurance? Like how many of you have flood insurance? Or know what your flood insurance zone is? Good, all right, so there's some familiarity. So, all right. Basically, what I wanted to do is provide a really quick overview of what the major issues in flood insurance are going to be with regards to people that you're working with, and also to demo our website, which is, as you can see here, is Flood Help NY, and this is still in beta, but you will have access to it at the actual help desks. So, flood insurance. There's a couple of things that are going on with flood insurance right now in New York City, and one of the really big ones is that we're actually in the process of updating our flood insurance rate maps. So basically, the flood insurance in New York is provided through the National Flood Insurance Program, which is a government-run program. And the reason government regulates and runs flood insurance, unlike most other forms of insurance, is that with floods you had a kind of a market, lack of a market in providing flood insurance because it's such a mass catastrophe that you had a lot of hurricanes, they wiped insurers out. So we created the National Flood Insurance Program in the 60s. And basically what that means is that a city or locality can opt into the flood insurance program, and when they do that, they create a flood insurance rate map, and they also then agree to create much stricter standards for building in their flood-prone areas. And then sort of as a, in addition to doing that, everything that was built prior to that date gets grandfathered in so that they get to see subsidized flood insurance rates. So New York City joined the National Flood Insurance Program in the 80s, and we have a flood insurance rate map here, which I'll show you what that is, that was created then. And actually before Sandy struck, New York was in the process of updating its flood insurance rate maps. What we did in the 1980s was obviously technology, particularly mapping technology, because it improved quite a lot. And so actually, the new maps really reflect the actual degree of risk from flooding today much better than the ones that are currently in place. So let me show you. This is New York. Since we're going to the Rockaways first, I will show you the Rockaways. Okay. So this is a piece of it, and as you can see, there are 3 zones, V, which is orange, A, which is purple, and then X, which is yellow. And I just want to show basically how the new maps will change the type of zones people have in New York, in the Rockaways. So basically what you need to know is that V and A, these are the high-risk flood zones. This is the area where you have a 1% chance of being flooded on a given year. Like basically they call it also the 100-year floodplain. If you live in this zone, you're at very high risk of flood damage, and you're also generally required to get flood insurance. But I'm going to show you what the new maps are doing to the Rockaways, because it's pretty dramatic. Right? So you can see that a lot more people are going to be added to the high-risk flood zones when the new maps are implemented. And they're right now projected to go into effect in 2016. So this is currently the map that's ruling. However, New York has already adopted, zoning changes to, take the newer flood zones into account. So basically, what we would do is we would look up, if you wanted to provide someone some one-on-one information about what their flood risk is, you look up their address. So what's the address of the first help desk?
This is 22 Reed Street here.
454 Beach 67th Street.
Okay, so look it up. All right, so this is this is the address, and we can see here that it is in a high-risk flood zone. And when we look at what the flood insurance rate map is for 2016, it's still there. So basically, what you can do with this information is let someone know. The first question that they're going to have is if they're required to get flood insurance. Now, it's important. So if they're actually in the flood insurance, if they're in the high-risk zone now, they're required to. And if they're going to be added to it, then they will be required to get flood insurance, basically. We have lots of, disclaimers all over the website saying things like this one, really important distinction. Homeowners insurance, if you actually buy a homeowners insurance policy, it'll say it's covered for hurricanes. However, and people think that that means that, a lot of people understandably thought that that meant that they had insurance. However, homeowners insurance does not cover flooding. And a lot of people learned very much the hard way that they were not insured when their homes were devastated by Sandy flooding. So if we were to, as we go through the website, you can see this section of the website, am I required to get flood insurance, is something that people will want to know. Basically, there's 2 ways someone is required to get flood insurance. If you're in a high-risk flood zone and you have a mortgage, you're required. And also, if you've received FEMA aid or Build Back aid, which I imagine is going to be most of the people in this that you're talking to, even if they're not in a high-risk flood zone, they will still often need to keep flood insurance if they ever receive federal disaster aid. So it's, that's one of the consequences. If you get federal disaster aid once, part of the receipt of that, actually, there's a legal obligation to get flood insurance. And then if you don't have flood insurance, the next time there's a disaster, the government will not help you. So basically, this part of the website sort of gives information about that. For example, if you want to know about the consequences of getting FEMA aid in the past, this basically will tell you what I just told you. I don't want to get too much more into it. I think basically for the purposes of what you're doing, you're going to want to know what the zones are, what the new zones are, if it's high risk, if it's required, and that's going to provide, a big chunk of information. You will be able to email people who you're consulting. They're sort of a kind of a write-up of their results by going to the What's My Rate section. And by the time that you are in the help desks, we'll have kind of some more instructions on how exactly to do that. So yeah, the other parts of the website, they have some resources, more information, how do you get flood insurance, and then some frequently asked questions that kind of provide background into what's going on with flood insurance, why are the maps changing, what does this mean, and I think that's all that I have time for. So, oh, I have 2 more minutes? Okay.
You don't have to take all of your time. It's okay. We can also take questions at the end.
Sure, all right. Questions? Yes?
Will we be able to peruse the site for meeting with people, discussing with people, just so we have familiarity with it?
Yeah. But we can work that out to send everyone who's volunteering for the first one, you know, the URL and the password. By the time probably the second round of HelpDesk start, this should all be live anyway, so anyone can go and look and learn about flood insurance.
Great.
Anything else? Sorry, I know this is really kind of a dense topic. Yes?
So for Zone A or B, you're required to pursue flood insurance. Zone C will not be?
It's actually Zone X, and no, they're not. They're in what's called the medium risk zone. That's a 500-year floodplain. Sandy was actually, it was a once in every 500-year flooding event. So it did actually flood a lot of people in the X zones. They're not required to get flood insurance. If they do want to get flood insurance, they can get it for a pretty cheap rate. And so the What's My Rate section of the website kind of goes into that. However, if they did receive federal disaster assistance, then they should know that if they don't have flood insurance, there will be in a pretty desperate situation if they get damaged again, because it won't be eligible for federal disaster assistance in the future.
There's a popular misconception about the evacuation zones versus
Yes.
the flood zones. So they're,
We have a whole, yes, right. So probably some of you who may have seen the Know Your Zone campaign. It's really, that has to do with evacuations and disasters. This is different. Flood zones really have to do with your risk of damage to a property, and evacuations is really, you know, your risk to your person. And with that, I am getting stopped. But if you have any more questions, maybe you can refer them to Sarah at the center, who's coordinating on our end, and she can give any additional information. Thank you.
And just between presenters, a really important question. We are planning to have pizza brought in for our 7 o'clock break. Maybe not the thing you crave the most on a 90-degree day, and we apologize if you're gluten-free or dairy-free because this isn't going to work. Show how many people think you're hungry enough to eat 1 slice of pizza? Quick show of hands.
at least one.
At least one. How many people think you're hungry enough to eat 2 slices of pizza? More than 2. Don't be shy. Okay, that's just to give us an approximation. We'll get a variety of toppings. Vegetarian, you're good. As I say, dairy-free, gluten-free. Sorry about that.
Okay, so if you thought her material was dense, mine is extremely dense. I'm going to cover the construction requirements of the building code as they pertain to construction in the flood zone. Just to hammer further what she was speaking about as far as the different types of flood zones, there's the V zone, which is the high velocity wave action. That's where you're going to have the most rigorous building code requirements. There's the coastal A zone, which we currently don't have requirements for in our building code, but they are shown on the preliminary flood insurance rate maps, which she mentioned. Just one point really quickly, she mentioned that there are there are zoning requirements that mandate that you use the preliminary flood insurance rate maps. But there's also a local law that was passed, Local Law 96 of 2013, which mandates, for building code purposes, the use of the preliminary flood insurance rate maps or the effective flood insurance rate maps from 2007. So it's no longer optional per a zoning executive order or anything like that. It's now mandated that you use the preliminary flood insurance rate maps for construction in the special flood hazard area. So when you're presenting to your homeowners, make sure that you show them the more stringent of the two and say, hey, this is what you're designing to. Coastal A zone, That's where you have, it's a subset of the A zone where you can expect moderate wave action, not intense wave action, but there's still special design requirements in our new building code, but likely you're going to be dealing with 2008 building code, I'm not really sure. The zone A is more where you're dealing with still water flooding. That's where the flood will sort of raise, the flood waters will rise, and you're not really dealing with flood waters that are moving per se. You're not really dealing with wave action. And then the zone X, as far as building codes required, there are not currently requirements for construction in zone X. I think we've already covered this. So the base flood elevation, which was already discussed, is the elevation that floodwaters will rise to during the design flood, or and it has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. So there are pre-firm buildings and post-firm buildings. So New York City adopted our flood insurance rate maps and our ordinance, our local ordinance, in 1983. So any buildings built before 1983 are considered pre-firm. Any buildings built after 1983 are post-firm. And any ground elevations before 1983 are considered pre-firm for flood zone purposes. So there was also a datum change with a local law 96 as well. Previously the city datum was NGVD 1929, and now the city datum is NAVD of 1988. So the preliminary flood insurance rate maps are listing all of their base flood elevations in the datum NAVD of 88. The homeowner may present you with an old survey that's showing a datum of NGVD 1929 or Queens Road datum or who knows what. So it's important for you to make sure that when you're comparing the two elevations, that you're comparing the same datum. So there is a means to convert between the different datums, and that can be found either in our building code or there's another nice website which is region2coastal.com. That's another lookup tool where you can put in addresses and get the different special flood hazard areas, and you can get information about converting between different datums. So once again, that's region2coastal.com. That's a FEMA supported website. So where a building is located in multiple flood zones, so if you're looking at the flood map and you see that just a little corner is located in the AE zone, but the rest is located in an X zone, the more stringent flood hazard area applies to the entire building. So even if just a little corner is touched by the flood zone, you have to treat it like the entire building is located in the flood zone. So for residential construction, which mainly you're going to be dealing with residential construction, all new buildings and substantial improvements have to comply with the Appendix G, which is where all the flood-related requirements are located in the 2008 New York City Building Code. So if you have a 1968 code building that's substantially improved, then it's going to have to comply with the 2008 New York City Building Code Appendix G like a new building. Or if you have new construction, it's going to have to comply like a new building for Appendix G. And the main requirement for residential buildings is that the lowest floor, including the basement, has to be elevated above the design flood elevation. So we talked about base flood elevation, right? We talked about that's the level shown on the flood insurance rate maps, the 1% flood, right? But the design flood elevation is a little different. It makes you incorporate some freeboard, and I'm going to cover that in a second. But just note that there's a difference between base flood elevation and design flood elevation. So here is Table 2-1. And this was recently amended by another local law to add 2 foot of freeboard for 1 and 2 family homes. So the way the Appendix G work is you determine the structural occupancy category of the building. It's either a structural occupancy category 1, 2, 3, or 4. The higher the structural occupancy category, the more restrictive the requirements are, the more freeboard that's required. So for a structural occupancy category 1 building, we're talking like an agricultural building or a grain silo or something like that, the design flood elevation is equal to the base flood elevation because the risk of that thing being flooded is, oh, who cares? Not really, but. So then for structural occupancy category 2 buildings, you're talking about a 1 and 2 family dwelling. This was recently amended to add 2 foot of freeboard, so the design flood elevation is equal to the base flood elevation shown on those maps, which was previously discussed, whatever that number is, plus 2 foot of freeboard. And that's the elevation of your lowest floor. Okay? So for all other buildings, this is not a 1 and 2 family building, maybe you have a 3 family, 4 family, whatever. That's going to be structural occupancy category 2, all others, and that's going to require 1 foot of freeboard. I think that should cover the majority of the buildings that you're going to deal with. So it's important to realize that basement for flood zone purposes is different than basement in zoning and basement in building code. So for flood zone purposes, the portion of the building having its floors subgrade, below grade on all 4 sides is considered a basement. And basements are a no-no in the flood zone, because when the flood comes, the basement fills with water, and then somebody has to come and pump it out. So this is what a basement is defined as, and the lowest floor, this is way too much text, but I'm just going to quickly state that it's a really important slide though, and I know it's annoying, but I'm going to go over the lowest floor for a little bit. It's the floor of the lowest enclosed area, including the crawl space and the basement, and there's exceptions to the definition of the lowest floor. So you can have something below the lowest floor and it wouldn't be considered the lowest floor if you're building a new building or a building is substantially improved, and that's a wet flood-proofed enclosure for residential buildings. And a wet flood-proofed enclosure mainly is an area that is constructed of flood-resistant materials, and it has these vents that allow water to come in and come out, and then someone would go underneath there and hose it down and they're good to go. They don't have to replace the building materials because they're all flood-resistant materials, typically concrete, tile, not sheetrock, not typically anything that would support the growth of mold. And that's bullet 2. The floor of such enclosure has to be at or above the lowest adjacent grade. Lag is a really important term. You're going to see it on the elevation certificate you're looking at. Lowest adjacent grade is the grade outside the building. So it's the lowest grade outside the building. So the interior space that's enclosed can't be below that lowest adjacent grade. Okay, so let's skip this one. Quickly looking at these different diagrams. Do we have a pointer? No? Okay. So these are basically showing you what are acceptable construction types for substantially improved and new construction and what are not. And I think what it's trying to illustrate here is that the lowest floor of the building all the way to the left, for flood zone purposes, because this is wet flood proofed, you have the vents, the grade is the same on the interior and the exterior, is going to be rated all the way up top. It's not going to be the space below because this is an enclosure, which is an exception to the definition of lowest floor. Basically, all of the other scenarios are no good because you have the enclosure is below the lowest adjacent grade in pretty much all of these scenarios. So the takeaway from this is that you have to have the lowest adjacent grade and the interior of the enclosed space pretty much at the same level. As far as enclosures are concerned, so this is where people are going to be elevating their buildings, right? Because they want to get the insurance benefits of elevating their building, and they also want to, make your building more resilient. So they're going to be elevating the lowest floor, and they're going to want to use that space below for something, right? And it's this enclosure that's wet flood-proof that I've been talking about. The uses for enclosures below the lowest floor are parking for vehicles, storage, building access, and that's it. Those are the only uses. So basically, it must be clear to them that they're losing this space when they elevate this building. It can be used for parking, storage, and building access only. It can't be used for, living space. So this is talking about the enclosure and wet floodproofing, the vents are going to allow the water to come in automatically. When the floodwaters rise, the flood vents let the water right in, and then it lets the water right out. And what that does is it prohibits water pressures from building up, unequal hydrostatic forces. And in this instance, you had a basement wall that failed because this wasn't properly wet floodproofed. So here's a quick diagram of a wet floodproof space. You can see they've got the flood vent. The interior grade is at the same elevation as the exterior grade. And it's all flood resistant materials below the lowest floor. And here is just a quick picture of a space that did not use flood resistant materials and supported gross amount of mold. FEMA has a technical bulletin 2, which covers all the different types of materials that are permissible for use within wet flood-proofed enclosures below the design flood elevation. And as you can see, there's different classes of building materials. So a class 5 is acceptable, class 1 is not acceptable, 5, 4 are acceptable, and 3 through 1 are not acceptable. So for instance, concrete block as a wall or ceiling is considered class 5 material. It's acceptable, it's great. So for structural design, for new and substantially improved buildings, it's imperative that the footings be designed to prevent flotation, collapse, and lateral movement during the design flood, and that's all. ASCE 24 is the reference standard, national reference standard, which we adopted in Appendix G, and there's a lot of references to ASCE 24, and this one is in reference to structural considerations. So ASCE 24 has been amended extensively in this region in New York City. So you have to look in Appendix G, Section 501, lists all the different amendments to ASCE 24. So if you were to look in ASCE 24 at those tables I was just showing you, table 2-1, it would show you that design flood elevation is equal to the base flood elevation plus 1 foot of freeboard for structural occupancy category 2 building. I know this is probably, but you just know that you have to look and make sure that you're accounting for the amendments in Appendix G to this reference standard. For residential buildings in a Zone A, all utilities and attendant equipment have to be located above the design flood elevation, and this is specified in Table 7-1. Typically, we see people trying to elevate on pedestals or elevating on frames exterior of the building. So mainly what we're trying to do is elevating is the best way to defend utilities against damage and flood. Here's a storage tank that actually was unable to counter buoyant forces and popped right out of the ground. So ASCE 24 talks about the fact that storage tanks have to be anchored to, I think it's 1.5 times the buoyant force to make sure that they don't pop out of the ground. And in some instances, you're going to be dealing with septic installations, septic design. The main thing that you don't want to happen during a design flood is for the contents of the septic system to discharge into the floodwaters. So that's why neoprene gaskets are required, backflow preventers are required to make sure that when you flush, it doesn't go directly into the floodwaters. This is typical new construction in the A zone. I think this is in Staten Island somewhere. What you see here is that there's parking below the lowest floor, which is acceptable, and the stairs are leading up to this lowest floor, which is elevated. So this is typical A zone construction. So I don't think you're going to really deal with non-residential buildings. Are we going to deal with non-residential buildings?
Maybe a few.
Okay.
Mixed use.
Mixed use. So for Appendix G has a specific definition for residential and non-residential. When you're dealing with residential buildings, your only option is really to elevate and to use a wet flood-proofed enclosure below the lowest floor. You cannot have a subgrade space. That's it. Residential buildings, you're really limited. But if you're non-residential, as defined here in Appendix G, you're permitted to use a technique called dry flood proofing, or you can elevate. Elevating is always the best because it's, you're not relying on any human intervention to install floodgates or anything like that. But some instances, it's not feasible to elevate. You just can't do it. So then dry floodproofing becomes your next option if you're non-residential for flood zone purposes. So in order to be considered non-residential for flood zone purposes, usually we're seeing item 2 is the trigger, where you contain residential space, but you also contain space on the lowest floor that's not accessory, as such term is defined in the New York City zoning resolution to group I1, R1, R2, R3. So if you have a bodega or something like that on the first floor, then you could be considered non-residential for flood zone purposes, and now you can have a basement, and you can flood-proof, and you can do certain things that you couldn't do if you were residential. So, as I mentioned, you can either elevate or dry flood-proof non-residential buildings. It's expensive, and it takes considerable design to dry flood-proof. You have to account for buoyant forces, for hydrostatic, hydrodynamic forces, and there are significant structural modifications that are usually required, but it's feasible for certain types of buildings. And you can see here they're using floodgates to block the doorway. And this is the one all the way on the right. The wall is constructed of flood-resistant materials. In order to be considered dry flood-proof, you have to be substantially impermeable to the walls. The exterior walls have to be substantially impermeable to the passage of water. So that's typical of concrete and masonry construction. Masonry, unreinforced masonry, only to a certain height. So here, for dry floodproofing, you can see that for non-residential buildings, for structural occupancy category 2, mainly what you're going to be dealing with, you're only required to dry floodproof to 1 foot of freeboard, as opposed to the elevating to 2 foot of freeboard. So your design flood elevation is BFE plus 1 foot. This requirement here, you can see that this flood gate is blocking a required means of egress. And ASCE 24 section 6223 or something has a requirement that wherever a blocked means of egress, wherever a required means of egress is blocked, somewhere in the building you have to provide an alternate means of egress. But we went so far as to change that and say that, well, any required means of egress requires an alternate means of egress immediately adjacent to it. So it's not acceptable to, as of right, just say, oh, well, the egress is in the back of the building, we're going to block this one, and there's an alternate in the back, not to worry. It has to be immediately adjacent to, so that someone who's attempting to get out that entrance can look to the right or left and see signage and, be able to get out. As far as utilities and equipment, when they're within